The ruins of forgotten estates whisper louder than any church bell. Among the scattered stones of Charleston's abandoned plantations, one name is still spoken with unease. Ravencroft was the dynasty, but it was an agreement that undid them. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The story begins as most tragedies do, not with war or famine, but with a celebration that concealed the seed of its own ruin. In the year 1819, Charleston County, South Carolina was already regarded as one of the wealthiest centers of the American South. Families of vast means and proud lineages sought constantly to outdo one another in displays of grandeur, balls, feasts, the acquisition of foreign luxuries. All of these marked the competition of Charleston's planter elite. Yet beneath the varnish of civility, the entire structure rested upon a foundation of violence and bondage so ordinary that it scarcely raised a whisper among those who profited from it. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft, decorated veteran of the 1812 campaigns and heir to an already considerable fortune, was among those who lived by the cruel arithmetic of this system. His reputation was formidable, a man of rigid discipline, striking presence and ambition that pressed him toward every opportunity to elevate his name. By 1818, he had secured not only a seat among Charleston's wealthiest landholders, but also the hand of Cordelia Harrow, daughter of another planter house with ties reaching into Georgia and Alabama. Their marriage, announced with all the pomp fitting two dynasties of blood and property, was intended to cement their influence for generations to come. The ceremony itself, held in the winter of 1819, remains notorious. The newspapers of Charleston recorded the excess, imported wines, a banquet of extravagant variety, and music imported from Philadelphia. Yet the guests would later remember not the grandeur of the occasion, but the singular macabre gift presented by Colonel Ravencroft to his bride. While others offered silver, jewels, and fine horses, the colonel arranged for something far more shocking: 7 human beings. They were a family, bound together by blood and circumstance, purchased at considerable expense from a neighboring estate. Each bore the same surname, Cain. Their ages ranged from the patriarch Isaac, already gray at the temples, to a boy not yet grown to manhood. With calculated ceremony, Ravencroft declared these 7 lives not merely property, but Cordelia's personal gift. His words, noted in more than one diary of the event, were delivered without shame: 7 souls to serve you, as constant as loyalty itself. From this day forward, the company erupted into uneasy applause. Some guests whispered admiration for the colonel's audacity, while others turned away, uneasy with the deliberate spectacle of human beings presented as tokens of affection. Yet none dared speak openly against him. Charleston's elite was bound by unspoken rules, and one of them was silent. Cordelia, for her part, received the gift with a composure that unsettled even her closest companions. She neither flinched nor protested, but accepted the chain of their bondage with a curiously steady gaze. In her hands, the Ravencroft dynasty would find its most terrible chapter. To understand the events that followed, one must consider the unique place Cordelia Harrow occupied within her world. Unlike many planters' daughters whose education was confined to the arts of music, embroidery, and scripture, Cordelia had been raised in a household where her father encouraged a broader curiosity. She read medical tracts imported from Edinburgh, was acquainted with contemporary theories of anatomy and psychology, and showed unusual fascination with the mechanics of discipline. By the time she entered the Ravencroft marriage, whispers already circulated in Charleston drawing rooms that she was too clever for comfort. The gift of the Cain family did not therefore pass into idle possession. Cordelia saw in them not only servants but material for what she later described in private letters still extant in archives as her study of the human will. She believed, as did certain fringe thinkers of her time, that the human spirit could be measured, tested, and broken in systematic ways. For her, the Cain family represented not labor but opportunity, a laboratory disguised as a household. Colonel Ravencroft, though stern and practical, was not blind to his wife's peculiar interests. Some evidence suggests he even encouraged them. In correspondence dated March 1820, he wrote to a fellow officer that Cordelia was preparing innovations that shall make our holdings the envy of the county. To him, cruelty rationalized as science was not cruelty at all, it was efficiency, and efficiency promised profit. The Cain family's names are preserved in ledgers, and it is worth noting them here, for each will figure prominently in the unfolding tragedy. Isaac, the patriarch, 50 years of age; his wife, Eliza, whose quiet resolve is remarked upon even in hostile testimony; their eldest son David, scarcely 20, already marked by leadership; beside him, Ruth, 17, whose intelligence rivaled any in Charleston despite the silence imposed upon her; and the younger trio, Joseph, 15, Margaret, 12, and little Samuel, not yet 10. 7 souls, bound together, delivered into the hands of a household that saw them less as human beings than as instruments of experiment. The first records of Cordelia's methods emerge in mid. Visitors to the plantation reported strange absences, noting that the Kane family was seldom seen among the fields. Overseers, when pressed, offered only evasions. One wrote privately to his brother, "There is a chamber in the north wing, always closed, where the mistress conducts her study. She keeps the Kane brood near her constantly, not in labor but in confinement. What transpires there I cannot say, but the air of dread is plain enough." By 1821, fragments of Cordelia's notes begin to appear in what historians now call the Ravencroft Papers. These documents, preserved only through later discovery in abolitionist archives, reveal a chilling cadence, numbered observations, clinical language, and the unmistakable presence of deliberate torment disguised as inquiry. She wrote of resistance thresholds, of the breaking point of loyalty, of obedience rendered not through fear but through annihilation of self. The Kane family were her subjects. Their pain was her curriculum. Colonel Ravencroft shielded these activities with ruthless efficiency. Overseers who questioned too closely were dismissed. Neighbors who inquired found themselves discouraged with veiled threats, and yet whispers traveled as whispers always do. By late 1821, Charleston society was murmuring of unusual practices at Ravencroft Plantation. Some dismissed it as envy, others as rumor. Only a few suspected that what had begun as a grotesque wedding gift was evolving into something systematic, something darker than ordinary cruelty. There is in the record a striking silence during the years. Few documents survive from the plantation, as though an intentional effort had been made to obscure them. But from scattered testimonies of the enslaved community, one picture emerges. The Kane family, though confined and tormented, endured with a quiet resilience that unsettled their captor. Isaac's faith, Martha Washington later recalled, kept the circle of 7 unbroken. Ruth whispered prayers that turned into plans, and David, young David, listened, learned, and began to imagine possibilities his tormentors could not fathom. The Ravencroft dynasty, outwardly secure, was already trembling beneath the weight of the very experiment it believed would strengthen it. What began as a gift would become a curse. What was intended as a bond between two families would ignite the destruction of one, and the names of Ravencroft and Kane, forever entangled, would pass into legend, not through prosperity but through horror. The Ravencroft plantation in the early 1820s stood as a paradox, outwardly flourishing, inwardly rotting. Its fields, tended by more than 100 enslaved laborers, produced respectable yields of cotton and rice. The house itself, a brick structure raised in the Georgian style, still received visitors with an air of dignity. Yet those who lingered too long, who watched too closely, often left unsettled. For the order of Ravencroft was not the natural order of a prosperous estate. It was the brittle order of a household consumed by secrecy. Colonel Ravencroft maintained the facade of discipline with military precision. He drilled his overseers as though they were soldiers, insisted on reports delivered in neat handwriting, and recorded every expense in his ledger with near obsessive care. Yet no amount of meticulousness could mask the unease that spread among his own ranks. Overseers whispered of strange cries in the night. House servants spoke of doors barred at all hours, and of Cordelia's shadow crossing the upstairs hall with a lamp long after midnight. One particular letter, preserved in a Charleston archive, is especially telling. Dated June 1821, it was written by Jonathan Pierce, an overseer who had resigned his post abruptly. He addressed it to his cousin in Savannah. "I confess I have seen many cruelties in this life, and I have overseen punishments without hesitation. But what I have witnessed in the north wing of this house I cannot in good conscience continue to abandon. The mistress conducts her works upon the Kane family, and it is not the common chastisement of slaves, but a deliberate construction of torment. She records each reaction, as though they were figures in a ledger. The colonel smiles upon it as though it were progress. I tell you plain, cousin, it is not progress, but damnation." This letter never saw the light of Charleston society at the time, for Jonathan Pierce fled southward and died of fever within 2 years. But its preservation testifies to a growing dread among those forced to look too closely at Cordelia's studies. The Kane family themselves enduring glimpses, like figures caught between shadows of testimony. A field hand recalled that Eliza, the mother, was once permitted into the kitchen garden under watch. Her back bore marks, not of the lash, but of careful incisions, rows of scars so regular that the other women whispered she had been cut as one would mark cloth for pattern. Young Samuel, the smallest of the 7, was sometimes seen through the windows of the north wing, standing motionless at Cordelia's command, eyes wide with fear but jaw clenched as though he knew defiance would cost him dearly. Ruth, the 17-year-old, emerges in these recollections as particularly striking. A housemaid remembered her as silent, her lips pressed tight whenever she was led through the hall, but her eyes sharp as a needle, and watching everything. Even in torment, Ruth observed, catalogued and learned. The Kane family did not shatter easily, and this endurance would prove the Ravencrofts' undoing. Cordelia's notes, pieced together later by abolitionist collectors, reveal her growing frustration during these years. Her writing is methodical, numbered, clinical. Subject 1. Isaac demonstrates remarkable capacity for silent endurance. Punishments that reduce others to pleading produce only muttered prayer in this specimen. Subject 3. David resists attempts at psychological dominance, displays leadership traits, intercedes for others even when doing so worsens his own punishment. Observation. The spirit may be broken only if hierarchy within group is dismantled. Subject 4. Ruth is difficult to assess, complies outwardly, but silence conceals unknown interiors. Watch closely. In these fragments we see the core of Cordelia's obsession. She did not merely seek to control, she sought to annihilate. To her the Kane family were a puzzle. Why did 7 individuals bound in suffering continue to preserve their bonds rather than betray one another? Why did their loyalty deepen rather than dissolve under torment? For Cordelia, this was a failure of her methods. For history, it was the beginning of her unraveling. Meanwhile, the larger enslaved community of Ravencroft Plantation watched with growing unease. They saw the Kane family vanish from fields, only to reappear thin, scarred, but unbroken. They heard muffled cries through the brick walls of the North Wing, cries that ceased suddenly, replaced by silence more terrible than sound. Martha Washington, the elderly cook who would later become central in preserving this history, began gathering the whispers of others. She noted when the lamps burned all night in Cordelia's chamber, when Isaac was led out with blood on his clothes, when David's eyes met hers in the kitchen yard, and conveyed both exhaustion and determination. Through these whispers, a quiet network formed. At first it was nothing more than prayer circles, murmured hymns that doubled as coded speech, but by 1822, it had grown into something more. The Kane family, through glances and brief exchanges, communicated strategies to others. David especially seemed to grasp instinctively how information could be carried without detection. A gesture, a pause in song, a phrase repeated at just the right moment, all became tools for passing knowledge. The Ravencrofts believed they were isolating the Kane family to study obedience. In truth, they were forging leaders. The year 1823 brought the first clear signs of collapse. Records from creditors show that Colonel Ravencroft began spending heavily on repairs and security improvement. The plantation's profits, once steady, declined as more resources were diverted into protecting secrets rather than producing cotton. Overseers were rotated frequently, as one after another either resigned or was dismissed under suspicion of disloyalty. That summer, a visitor from Charleston, Mr. Edward Holloway, recorded in his journal a dinner at the Ravencroft home. His entry is brief but telling. The meal was sumptuous, but the atmosphere most peculiar. The mistress spoke little, only regarding her guests with a fixed and unsettling gaze. At one point, a sound from the upper floor, something between a moan and a shout, interrupted our conversation. The colonel excused it as illness among the servants, but the silence that followed made the explanation ring hollow. I left with the impression of a house haunted not by spirits but by something worse, its own living inhabitants. The cracks in the facade could no longer be contained. Among the enslaved, however, cracks meant opportunity. Martha Washington's prayer circles grew bolder, more organized. Information about overseers' weaknesses, about guard rotations, about storehouse locks, all began to circulate with deliberate intent, and at the center of this silent revolution was David Kane, no longer merely a victim, but a strategist in embryo. His capacity for observation, honed under torment, became a weapon sharper than any blade. It is here, in the early 1820s, that the Kane family's endurance transformed into resistance. Though confined, though scarred, they radiated a defiance that spread quietly across the plantation, and the more Cordelia sought to break them, the stronger their influence became. The Ravencrofts had sought to create compliance so perfect it could be sold as innovation. Instead, they created the seed of insurrection. By autumn of 1823, the air in Charleston carried rumors that could not be silenced. Some spoke of strange disappearances of overseers, others of tools sabotaged in ways too precise to be mere accident. A few whispered that the Kane family, once presented as a grotesque wedding gift, now formed the nucleus of something larger, something the Ravencrofts themselves could no longer control. The stage was set. What began with 7 souls in chains was about to become a reckoning for an entire dynasty. The year 1824 dawned heavy with storm clouds over the Carolina coast, and within the Ravencroft estate the same turbulence stirred. To outward appearances, the plantation still functioned.
Bales of cotton left its gates, accounts were balanced, and the colonel still entertained certain allies at his long mahogany table, yet the house itself, the heart of the enterprise, seemed less a dwelling and more a fortress of suspicion. Servants moved stiffly, overseers watched one another with narrowed eyes, and Cordelia's lamps burned through nights so long that even the crows abandoned their perches at dawn, unsettled by the ceaseless glow. It was during this season that the first true act of defiance revealed itself not to the public, but to those within the Ravencroft walls. The incident is preserved in an overseer's complaint letter, discovered decades later among auctioned estate papers.
A store of tools was found rendered useless by some deliberate filing at the joint. Axes, hoes, and plows, every edge spoiled in such a way as to escape immediate notice until brought to use. The damage was too orderly to be chanced. I believe it the work of certain Negroes emboldened by indulgence, perhaps directed in secret by the Kane lot. The colonel dismissed the complaint publicly, calling it negligent, but privately he doubled the night watches and ordered that the Kane family never be permitted together unsupervised. Cordelia, on the other hand, received the news with a strange composure. In her journal she recorded the collective will, though broken by pain, seeks avenues of reunion. Destructive impulse may be traced to Subject 3 David and Subject 4 Ruth. Must intensify separation, yet record further to test the durability of this cohesion. Where the colonel saw sabotage, Cordelia saw experiment. She was no longer interested in cotton or coin. Her world had narrowed to the 7 subjects, to the puzzle of their loyalty. Among the enslaved community, however, the incident confirmed what many already sensed: the Kane family carried within them a spark too dangerous to ignore. Martha Washington, old though she was, began to speak more openly in the kitchen gatherings. "Them young ones, they don't bow the way others do. Mark me, the Lord's hand is on them. The mistress cuts their flesh but can't cut the spirit. That spirit's gone catch fire, and when it does we best be ready." Her words, veiled as prayer, spread as prophecy, and in that prophecy courage grew. Meanwhile Ruth Kane's role deepened. Witnesses later recalled that she developed a method of silent signaling using only her eyes and hands. In the laundry yard she would brush her knuckles twice against the basin to warn of an overseer's approach. In the kitchen she would fold a cloth in a certain angle to indicate which guard had drunk too deeply the night before. These gestures, small and fleeting, traveled quickly through the quarters, building a language invisible to the Ravencrofts. Her silence, which Cordelia mistook for compliance, was in truth her shield. Ruth absorbed her torment and transformed it into code. Colonel Ravencroft grew increasingly unstable during these years. His ledgers became erratic, margins crowded with notes that revealed more obsession than order. Creditors must not inquire, keep Pierce matter buried. Cordelia insists upon further funding for North Wing. The colonel was a man torn in 2 directions, one toward the rigid discipline of his military past, the other toward the chaos his wife was conjuring. He still believed he controlled his household, but his household was slipping from him inch by inch. By 1825, neighboring planters had begun to notice changes. One remarked, in a letter to his brother, that the Ravencrofts appear prosperous but are rarely seen abroad. Their slaves are restless-eyed, their overseers sour-faced. There is an air about the place not unlike powder waiting a spot. Cordelia's journals from this year mark her descent into something darker. She began numbering not only her subjects but her experiments. Experiment 23, deprivation of speech for Subject 4. Results inconclusive. Silence proves resilient. Experiment 24. Forced separation of maternal figure from offspring. Observation. Subject 1. Isaac. Displays unusual paternal assumption of authority. Group resilience persists. Experiment 25. Inducement of betrayal. Food reward offered to Subject 6. Jacob in exchange for information. Subject refused. Wept under lash but divulged nothing. Conclusion. Familial bond exceeds inducement threshold. The coldness of her notes chills the modern reader. Yet between the lines lies the truth she could not admit. Every experiment failed. Every attempt to reduce the Kane family to atomized obedience resulted in renewed unity. And with each failure, her rage grew. The enslaved community of Ravencroft Plantation, though bound, began to weave a hidden network of resistance around the Kane family. When Samuel, the youngest, was punished and left without food, others smuggled scraps into his bedding. When David's hands blistered from forced labor, men in the quarters passed him salves concocted from roots and ashes. The Kane family had become more than a household, they were a symbol, and symbols could not be lashed into silence. In March of 1826, A storm struck the coast with unusual fury. Lightning splintered a tree near the north wing, tearing into the wall and exposing the inner chambers where Cordelia had conducted her studies. For days afterward, workers were assigned to repair the damage, and though overseers tried to keep eyes away, word spread quickly. Strange instruments had been glimpsed within, tables fitted with restraints, glass jars with substances unknown. The storm had torn away the veil. What had been rumor became knowledge, and knowledge spread like wildfire. That summer, another overseer fled. His brief testimony, later preserved by abolitionist collectors, reads, "I am no friend to the Negro, but what is done in that house is not fit for Christian eyes. The mistress keeps them not for labor but for torment, and the colonel, though he pretends to command, is ruled by her madness. I will not remain where the devil's work is done." The Ravencrofts replaced him quickly, but replacements were wearing thin. By now the name Ravencroft carried a stain even among those accustomed to cruelty. The Kane family's quiet defiance reached its first climax in late 1826. One night, an overseer entered the quarters, searching for a stolen knife. He singled out Jacob Kane, accusing him falsely. When Jacob refused to kneel, the overseer raised his whip only for Isaac, the father, to step forward and take the blow in his stead. Witnesses later described how the entire quarter fell silent, then erupted in a hymn so loud the overseer fled, unsettled by the force of. That moment cemented the Kane family not merely as survivors, but as leaders of spirit. Their unity had become visible, undeniable. Cordelia's response was immediate and merciless. She ordered the family separated into different outbuildings, each confined under lock. But even this could not sever their influence. Songs traveled across the yard at night. Verses altered subtly to carry messages. Children whispered Ruth's hand signals when they thought no one watched. The Kane family had become an idea, and ideas do not yield to change. By 1827, Colonel Ravencroft's debts mounted, his crops failed and his alliances frayed. But Cordelia pressed on with her experiments. Blind to the ruin, she believed she was on the verge of a breakthrough, that one more cruelty, one more deprivation would finally shatter the Kane bond. Instead, she was feeding a fire she could not perceive. The dynasty, once proud and feared, now trembled on the edge of collapse, and in the shadows of its own making, the Kane family waited. The year was 1828, and the Ravencroft estate stood at a dangerous crossroad. From the road it still presented the mask of wealth, white columns polished, grounds trimmed, wagons moving in steady rhythm. Yet those who entered the gates quickly sensed that the house had soured. The laughter of children was absent. The clang of tools in the fields rang strangely hollow, and every corridor echoed with whispers that did not quiet even when overseers approached. Within the north wing, Cordelia persisted in her work. She had filled entire ledgers with her observations, lines written with mechanical neatness, but laced with an urgency bordering on mania. The Kane family was no longer recorded as individuals but as specimens. Cordelia spoke their names less and less, reducing them to numbers, as though stripping them of humanity might also strip them of defiance. Yet the more she wrote, the less control she possessed. For every deprivation inflicted, the family responded with fresh resilience. For every experiment, they discovered new ways to shield one another. The first serious sabotage occurred in the spring. A wagon laden with cotton bales mysteriously broke loose on the eastern slope and overturned into the creek. The colonel at first declared it an accident, but when the ropes were examined they bore signs of deliberate cutting. He ordered lashes for a group of field hands, though none confessed. Privately he seethed. Cotton was coin, and coin was slipping through his fingers faster each month. Cordelia's reaction, recorded in her hand, was colder. Evidence of coordinated destruction suggests the bond has extended beyond the Kane household into the general quarters. Control has diminished. To restore order, I must isolate further, but resources thin. She misjudged again. What she called contagion was not disease, but inspiration. The Kane family's endurance was becoming legend, and legend spread faster than fear. By midsummer, the overseers had begun to mutter among themselves. One left without notice, another took ill, and never returned. Their replacements were younger, harsher, but also more careless. They drank heavily and lashed out without judgment. This only deepened the cycle of resistance. Ruth Kane, ever silent, became a figure of almost supernatural reverence. When she walked the yards, children trailed her in silence, imitating her gestures. Adults listened when she tapped her fingers against her side, or lifted her chin at a certain angle. The overseers laughed at these small motions, seeing nothing in them, but the enslaved saw. Ruth was building an army without weapons,
an army of eyes and hands. Colonel Ravencroft grew gaunt, his fine coats hung loose. His handwriting faltered, his temper flared over trifles. He berated Cordelia in private, yet deferred to her in practice. Some evenings the two were heard shouting from behind the shuttered parlor windows, his voice raw with rage, hers icy with contempt. Those who listened closely said the colonel's authority ended where Cordelia's experiments began. It was around this time that Martha Washington, the elder matriarch, fell ill. Many assumed the sickness would claim her, yet she recovered slowly, and during her recovery she spoke often of vision. She declared that the Lord had shown her the Ravencroft dynasty toppled into dust, its halls filled with smoke, its masters scattered like chaff. The young listened with rapt faces, while the elders bowed their heads in silence. Cordelia dismissed Martha as delirious, but the prophecy passed from mouth to mouth until it became certainty. In October of 1828, the first blood was shed. An overseer named Keene had gained a reputation for cruelty beyond even his fellows. He took delight in starving men of rations, in setting impossible quotas, in striking without cause. One evening he cornered Jacob Kane near the barns and raised his whip for the smallest delay. Before the lash could fall, David Kane intervened. Accounts differ on whether he seized the whip itself, or merely shoved the overseer aside. What is certain is that Keene stumbled backward onto a harrow, the iron teeth cutting deep into his thigh. He bled heavily and died before morning. The colonel buried the body without ceremony and forbade any mention, but word spread instantly. To the overseers it was evidence of rebellion, to the enslaved, it was proof that even overseers could fall, and to Cordelia it was data. Subject 3 demonstrates protective instinct to extreme degree, violence initiated not for self, but for preservation of kin. This confirms hypothesis. Unity among them stronger than instinct for survival. They will risk death for one another. This bond is unnatural. It must be broken. Her words reveal the madness tightening around her. To her, love itself had become a disease to be studied, cured, and excised. The colonel responded with harsher discipline, chaining the Kane men separately, doubling their labor. Yet for all his efforts, he could not silence the whispers that ran like currents through the plantation. Keene's death became legend. Some said lightning struck him, others said his own cruelty turned upon him. Whatever the version, the moral was the same. Tyrants could Cordelia's nights grew longer. She experimented with new methods, prolonged hunger, forced wakefulness, punishments designed to pit one Kane against another, but none broke. Instead they seemed to grow stronger, their silence heavier, their endurance more astonishing. Ruth, in particular, remained untouched. Though her body bore scars, her eyes grew sharper, her signals bolder. One witness later swore that when Ruth walked past the overseers, she looked at them not as a slave, but as a judge awaiting their sentence. Whether true or not, it was enough to unnerve even hardened men. By 1829, the Ravencrofts' social standing had eroded. Invitations to their table dwindled. Creditors pressed harder. Rumors seeped outward. Whispers of strange practices, unexplained deaths, servants fleeing in the night. The dynasty that had once stood as a pillar of Carolina aristocracy now sagged under its own rot. Yet within the quarters, something new bloomed. Courage. Hymns once sung in whispers now swelled louder. Food was hidden and passed around with less fear. Even those who had once bowed quickly now lingered longer when Ruth raised her hand in signal. The Kane family had become more than victims. They had become leaders. The breaking point came one winter's evening. Snow had dusted the fields, rare for the region, and the overseers huddled near their fires. Cordelia ordered Isaac Kane, the father, dragged into the north wing for a final experiment. She intended to isolate him, to deprive the family of its foundation. But as Isaac was hauled away in chains, a sound rose from the quarters, a chant, low and steady, growing louder with each voice that joined. The chant carried across the yard, through the walls into the chamber where Cordelia prepared her tool. Witnesses said even Isaac smiled faintly as he was pulled inside. For the first time Cordelia faltered. She struck Isaac savagely, but the chant did not cease. It rolled like thunder, shaking her composure. That night overseers patrolled with torches, but they could not silence the voices. And from that moment forward, the Ravencrofts no longer ruled their land. The Kane family did, though silently, invisibly, through sheer force of endurance. The dynasty was unraveling thread by thread. The colonel's debts multiplied. Cordelia's obsessions consumed her, and the enslaved community no longer trembled as before. The storm Martha Washington had foretold was gathering. All that remained was the strike of lightning, and lightning, when it came, would not be merciful. The winter of 1830 ground into spring, with a grim heaviness that settled over the Ravencroft estate, though the house still stood tall, its painted shutters gleaming white against the South Carolina sky. It felt more like a fortress than a home. Guards patrolled even at dawn, their boots crunching the frost. Torches flickered in the fields at night, throwing long shadows across rows of cotton that had failed for the second year running. The colonel's accounts had slipped from deficit into catastrophe. Each precaution demanded coin, and each coin drained what little remained of the family fortune. Yet for all his expenditures, the land produced less than ever. Rumors of sabotage spread like fever. Horses sickened. Cotton bales rotted mysterious. Plows broke clean in the middle of furrows, their irons split as though by invisible hands. The overseers insisted it was chance or poor craft, but the colonel began to suspect something worse. Deliberate coordination. He was not wrong. The Kane family's influence had grown quiet and vast. What Ruth spoke with her eyes, others carried in their deeds. Small acts, tools misplaced, nails removed from wagon wheels, scraps of food hidden away, multiplied into a pattern that bled the plantation of its strength. Overseers could beat, starve, or threaten, but they could not silence what they could not see. Resistance had ceased to be individual defiance, and had become a system in itself, as methodical as Cordelia's ledgers, but infinitely more dangerous. Martha Washington, though old and frail, guided. From her straw pallet she whispered instructions to those who came to sit at her side. She named who could be trusted, who must be avoided, and when silence was safer than words. In her presence even the strongest bowed. She spoke of the Kane family as vessels chosen by Providence, and of the Ravencrofts as the pharaoh destined for ruin. The comparison took hold. Soon every lash that cracked across the fields was interpreted as the beating of drums before Exodus. Cordelia noted. Her notebook swelled with fresh pages, her handwriting now sharp and erratic. She obsessed over Ruth above all others. Where others saw silent grace, Cordelia saw a riddle she could not solve. Ruth absorbed pain without flinching, endured hunger without protest, and still held the eyes of those around her. It enraged Cordelia that her methods, refined with such cruelty, failed utterly against this woman. Subject 4 remains impervious. Must consider breaking via indirect application. Target offspring, kin, or community attachment. Their unity is unnatural. If unity is destroyed, will she fracture?
Thus began a new phase of her cruelty. No longer content with experimenting upon the Kane family alone, Cordelia began ordering punishments upon unrelated enslaved families whenever Ruth defied her demands. A child denied food, a mother beaten for imagined insolence. Each time Cordelia watched Ruth's face, hoping to see the mask crack. Each time Ruth remained stone, though her eyes grew darker with a hatred too deep for words. The colonel, meanwhile, was unraveling. He drank heavily, staggering through the halls with pistol always at his side. Guests were rare, creditors constant. One evening he erupted at a Charleston merchant who had come to collect a debt, firing his pistol into the ceiling before throwing the man bodily from the parlor. The story spread, branding him unstable, a man no longer fit for society. In his journal the colonel confessed fears he never spoke aloud. It is not merely rebellion of bodies but rebellion of order. They no longer fear me. Even the weakest slave looks upon me with eyes that do not bow. Cordelia insists her work will yield results. But each day the land withers and the people grow stronger. I begin to dread my own halls, for at night I hear voices not my own. Songs carried low yet heavier than sermons. Perhaps Martha's prophecy is true. Perhaps I have built not a dynasty but a tomb. The turning point came with fire. On a sweltering night in July 1830 the smokehouse ignited. Flames roared so high they lit the sky above the plantation. The overseers scrambled to form lines, but water buckets vanished, tools were missing, and confusion reigned. The fire consumed the building completely, taking with it a season's worth of meat stores. The colonel blamed negligence. Cordelia suspected sabotage. Among the enslaved, the truth was whispered with grim pride. The fire was no accident, but the first open strike against the Ravencroft machine. The destruction forced tighter measures. The colonel doubled patrols, locked gates, and cut rations further. Yet these measures only deepened resistance. Hunger made workers slower, fear made them cunning. Overseers reported that tools continued to disappear, fields yielded half what was expected, and whispers of escape routes reached even Charleston streets. Cordelia descended further into madness. She no longer cared for appearance. She locked herself in the north wing, emerging only to command fresh cruelty. She ordered Ruth flogged until her back ran red, then demanded she be placed at the center of the quarters so all might see her humiliation. Yet humiliation never came. Ruth endured in silence, lifting her eyes toward the crowd, and in those eyes the people read triumph. They saw that Ruth was flesh, yes, but unbroken. Cordelia raged for hours, scratching lines into her notebook until the ink tore through the page. Failure. Punishment breeds unity, not division. Their spirit is unnatural, defies rational measure. Beginning to suspect external influence, religious mania, perhaps demonic. She had inverted reality. What she called demonic was nothing more than human dignity refusing to bow. By late 1830, the Kane family had become more than legend. They had become strategy. David Kane, the eldest son, spoke little, but every action bore his mark. It was he who organized tools to vanish. He who guided others to feign illness at precise moments. He who mapped the overseer's routes and passed the knowledge along. His was a quiet genius for coordination. In another life he might have been a general. On the Ravencroft plantation, he was the architect of sabotage. Even the overseers began to sense his shadow. They watched him closely, but he gave nothing away. He labored as expected, eyes lowered, yet behind those eyes turned the gears of quiet war. The colonel's household cracked under the strain. Servants fled in the night. 2 of the youngest overseers abandoned their posts altogether. Cordelia pressed harder, but her fury now seemed less terrifying than desperate. The enslaved had seen the fear behind her eyes, and once fear is seen, power is lost. Martha Washington's prophecy was repeated openly. The Ravencrofts shall fall by the hands they tried to bind. It was no longer a whispered hope, but a cert. Even the children spoke it as if rehearsing a future they would soon inherit. On the final night of 1830, a storm struck. Winds howled across the plantation, tearing shutters loose and driving rain into the parlor. The colonel sat alone by the fire, pistol resting on his knee, staring into the flames as though they might reveal a way forward. Upstairs, Cordelia scribbled furiously, her candle guttering in the draught. In the quarters, however, there was not hymns of sorrow, but songs of freedom, rolling like thunder through the rain. Overseers shouted for silence, but the voices only rose higher, carried on the storm winds until the walls themselves seemed to tremble. The Kane family stood at the center, unbroken, their silence turned into something louder than any whip, defiance that could not be killed. And as the year ended, so too ended the illusion that the Ravencrofts ruled their land. They possessed the deeds, the ledgers, the chains, but the true power now lay in the hands of those they had sought to destroy. The dynasty was no longer dying, it was already dead, though the Ravencrofts had yet to see the core. The dawn of 1831 arrived over the Ravencroft plantation like a threat. The sky was gray and low, wind slicing across the decaying cotton field. Winter had left a residue of frost in the mornings, but even as the sun attempted to rise, it failed to pierce the gloom that had settled over the estate. The house looked hollow, its whitewashed walls gleaming faintly in the dim light, like a mask over something long dead. Inside, the colonel moved silently through corridors that once echoed with command. He now walked as if haunted, carrying the weight of failure that no money, no gun, no overseer could remedy. Each room he passed offered a reminder. Windows smashed by storms he could not control, shutters missing, walls scarred from tools wielded against his authority. Every step he took reminded him that his dominion had been eroded, not by armies or laws, but by a few determined souls who had once been considered powerless. Cordelia, meanwhile, had descended fully into obsession. Her notebooks overflowed with diagrams, observations, and calculations. She had begun to devise new experimental techniques, determined to break Ruth and the other 6 subjects who had become her nemesis. She worked late into the night, her candle smoke curling like a black serpent, her hands stained with ink and blood from minor self-inflicted scratches she claimed were necessary for focus. They resist all physical and psychological coercion. The methods must evolve. They are clever beyond measure, coordinating actions I cannot predict. I must find the flaw, or the program fails entirely. Failure is unacceptable. Her obsession was no longer solely with the Kane family. Cordelia had begun turning her gaze outward, imagining applications of her methods on other plantations, mapping hypothetical experiments across counties, and envisioning an empire built upon subjugation perfected into science. In her mind, failure was temporary, resistance merely a delay. But the Kane family had grown more formidable. David Kane's strategies had matured into a quiet, pervasive system. He had divided tasks among family members. Some feigned illness to distract overseers, others tampered with equipment, while Ruth and her siblings maintained morale, teaching patience and endurance, sharing knowledge of the plantation's weaknesses. Like a map of invisible tunnel, word had begun to spread beyond the Ravencroft boundaries. Trusted contacts in Charleston and surrounding towns began providing information, supplies and guidance. Escape routes were established, but they were not merely routes to freedom. They were conduits of intelligence. Messages were carried, hidden in bundles of laundry, in food baskets, and through visitors pretending to bring news of distant relatives. Each transmission added to a growing network that would eventually extend across South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. The network was no longer just defensive, it was proactive. Overseers disappeared, crops failed, and livestock was lost to what appeared to be mere accident. But the pattern was undeniable to those who observed closely. Every strike was coordinated, every failure deliberate, and every loss calculated to weaken the plantation system, without alerting immediate reprisal. Colonel Ravencroft was aware of some of this, though he refused to acknowledge it openly. He had begun keeping closer watch on the enslaved population, but paranoia often outpaced reality. Every whisper was a conspiracy, every glance carried hidden meaning. Guards were doubled, gates locked, and security measures tightened to a degree that left the plantation feeling more like a prison than ever. Yet these measures only further strained finances and emboldened the Kane family. Resistance fed on oppression. The more the colonel sought to control, the more opportunities arose for subtle sabotage. Cordelia remained blind to the full scope of what had taken root. Her attention was consumed by the immediate, her obsession with Ruth, her obsession with breaking the will of those she had deemed her subjects. She devised punishments that were cruelly inventive: sleep deprivation, isolation, psychological games designed to pit the family against one another. But every attempt failed. The Kane family adapted, survived and learned from each trial. "They are not merely surviving," she wrote one night, her ink smudged by tears. "They are learning. I see it in their eyes. Each glance, each gesture. They catalog my moves as though I am the subject of their experiment. Impossible. This cannot be allowed. I must reassert control." By midsummer, the plantation was in open disarray. Fields lay untended in parts, livestock was scattered or missing, and morale among overseers had plummeted. Panic became routine. The colonel's authority eroded visibly, and even the guards he relied upon grew hesitant. One young man refused to chase a group of workers who had vanished into the woods. He returned 3 hours later, pale and shaken, insisting he had seen eyes watching from the trees, figures moving faster than men. These whispers circulated among the enslaved population, as proof that the Kane family's influence had transcended physical control. Resistance had become mythic, a force that could strike anywhere and everywhere. It was no longer 7 people fighting for survival. It was an idea. David Kane understood this. He held meetings with trusted family members in secret locations, often in the forest beyond the plantation's edge. There, under the canopy of pines, strategies were mapped out. Sabotage targets were selected not randomly, but to maximize disruption while minimizing exposure. Information was gathered not just from observation, but from sympathetic allies among free blacks and other enslaved individuals who had witnessed or experienced similar oppression. The Kane family's network was growing beyond the plantation, slowly but inevitably forming a web that connected the oppressed across the region. Cordelia's obsession reached a fever pitch. She had begun conducting what she called integration tests on those she considered her failures, applying new psychological manipulations with meticulous care. Her notes revealed a mind increasingly untethered from reality, fixated on control, dominance, and the perfection of human breaking. Yet the Kane family had anticipated this escalation. They had observed, studied, and learned her patterns, and now each act of cruelty became a source of intelligence rather than a tool of submission. Ruth stands resolute. "They mimic my techniques in ways that mirror my own teaching. Every lash, every insult, every deprivation serves only to strengthen their unity. I am undone." Cordelia scribbled in the margins of a notebook, the words jagged with frustration. The psychological inversion was complete. The oppressor was learning from the oppressed, and the oppressed were using the oppressor's methods against her. By autumn, the pattern of coordinated disruption had reached a new intensity. Overseers vanished for days, returning only to spread tales of mysterious figures moving with purpose through the shadows. Crops were burned, plows destroyed and storehouses found ransacked. The colonel scrambled to respond.
Yet each countermeasure created new vulnerability. Each time he reinforced a section of the estate, another failed elsewhere. Panic and exhaustion gnawed at him, until he was a shadow of the man who had once commanded a small empire. Cordelia, increasingly isolated, began hearing whispers that were not there. Shadows shifted in her vision. Her fear grew daily, though she refused to admit it. The Kane family's influence was invisible, pervasive, and unstoppable. Their resistance was no longer confined to survival. It was active domination of her world, a mirror of the cruelty she had wielded so freely. "They are My methods have turned upon me," she scrawled one night, shaking with rage. "I see them in the walls, in the wind, in every reflection. They have become the experimenters. I am the subject, and I am failed." The final acts of Part 6 would culminate in a moment that no ledger, no whip, no strategy could erase. The realization that the Kane family was not seeking vengeance in the ordinary sense. They were dismantling the entire foundation of the Ravencroft system. Each act of sabotage, each escape, each whispered plan was a calculated step toward freedom, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been subjected to the machinery of cruelty. And by the end of the year, it became clear that the Ravencrofts no longer held dominion. The house stood, the land existed, the legal deeds remained on paper, but the true power had shifted irrevocably. 7 human beings once considered property had become a force capable of reshaping an entire region. The stage was set. Resistance had matured into strategy. Oppression had become its own undoing, and for the Ravencrofts, there would be no redemption, no recovery, only the slow inevitable collapse that comes when the very structures of control are turned against those who thought themselves untouchable. The Kane family had survived the impossible. They had endured the systematic torture of one of the South's most formidable experiments. They had escaped, observed, learned, and turned oppression into power. And now, with the new year upon them, the next phase of their plan, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of a single plantation, was poised to begin. The dawn of 1832 broke with a pale, uncertain light over the ruined Ravencroft plantation. Winter had retreated, but its chill lingered in the mornings, wrapping the estate in a gray shroud of frost and fog. The wind carried the scent of decayed crops and spoiled earth, a reminder of a year in which the plantation's productivity had collapsed under the calculated resistance of 7 determined individuals. The Kane family, having survived months of psychological torment and coordinated sabotage, now prepared for the next stage of their plan. They were no longer merely surviving. They were orchestrating a movement that would extend far beyond the boundaries of Ravencroft. David Kane, Ruth, and their siblings met in the remnants of a dilapidated barn, the floor strewn with straw and the scent of damp wood. There, under the cover of shadows, they laid out a blueprint that would reshape the balance of power in the region. "This is no longer about one plantation," David said, his voice calm but resolute. "Our knowledge, our experience must be shared. Every overseer, every system, every weakness we have observed is we strike not for revenge alone, but to build a network that ensures freedom is possible for those still bound." Each family member had a role. Some would travel to neighboring plantations under the guise of labor, observing routines and weaknesses, and gathering intelligence. Others would maintain communication with sympathetic free blacks and abolitionist contacts in Charleston and Savannah, ensuring that the information they collected could be strategically deployed. Ruth focused on coordination, establishing hidden drop points for messages and supplies, while David refined tactics for sabotage that would maximize disruption without immediate detection. The Kane family's first major operation targeted the plantation of a man named Elias Whitcomb, a wealthy owner known for cruelty toward his enslaved workers. Whitcomb's estate lay just 20 miles from Ravencroft, and intelligence gathered over months indicated both vulnerabilities, insecurity, and dissatisfaction among the enslaved population. Under the cover of darkness, a small group infiltrated the estate, disabling locks, loosening planks on storage sheds, and tampering with livestock enclosures.
The next morning, chaos erupted. Horses escaped, oxen overturned carts, and overseers were drawn into frantic attempts to contain the disruptions. Whitcomb himself was confronted with evidence that his estate had been undermined, yet he could not trace the sabotage to any individual. To the overseers and remaining laborers, it seemed as though misfortune had struck the plantation spontaneously. But the Kane family had done more than sabotage. They had left behind carefully placed measures, hidden in bundles of feed and water troughs, suggesting that resistance was possible and that aid was available for those willing to act. These messages were written in subtle ciphers, legible only to those with knowledge of the network the Kane family had established. In essence, Whitcomb's plantation had become the first domino in a chain reaction that would spread like wildfire across the region. Meanwhile, Colonel Ravencroft, now a broken man both financially and socially, wandered the decaying remains of his estate with increasing desperation. His paranoia had reached new heights. Every creaking floorboard, every rustle in the fields was interpreted as an omen. Guards reported strange shadows moving among the cotton rows at night. Tools vanished, then reappeared broken. The few remaining overseers demanded higher wages and more protection, all of which the colonel could no longer provide. Cordelia, though no longer alive, had left a legacy that continued to haunt him. The meticulous notes and experimental designs that she had obsessively recorded during her lifetime were discovered and studied by the Kane family prior to her death. These documents, once meant to consolidate control over enslaved populations, had been transformed into a blueprint for rebellion. The very science of domination that Cordelia had perfected now guided the instruments of liberation. "They took everything I created and turned it against me," Ravencroft murmured to himself one night, his voice hollow. "Every rule, every principle, every method I had built into control, they use it to destroy me." Across the region, whispers began to circulate about a strange new phenomenon. Plantations falling into disarray without warning, overseers vanishing under mysterious circumstances, crops failing without explanation. Rumors spoke of a network that spanned miles, coordinated by figures who had once been considered powerless. Some plantation owners dismissed the stories as exaggeration, while others, quietly observing the patterns, began to panic. The Kane family's influence extended beyond sabotage. They ensured that intelligence flowed to enslaved populations in distant plantations, teaching them methods of evasion, subtle defiance, and communication that undermined traditional hierarchies. By mid-1832, the network had reached at least a dozen plantations across 3 counties. Messages detailing weak points in security, opportunities for collective action, and safe routes for escape were being transmitted through coded letters, hidden compartments, and trusted messengers. The Kane family had become the nucleus of a movement whose reach no one could fully comprehend. One particularly daring operation targeted a sugar plantation near Charlotte. The estate was heavily fortified and closely monitored by armed guards, yet intelligence gathered by the Kane family revealed an exploitable flaw: a routine change in the night watch schedule and a reliance on a single overseer to manage critical operations. Under the cover of darkness, a small group infiltrated the plantation, subtly sabotaging essential tools and creating diversions that allowed the enslaved workers to escape temporarily and sabotage storage facilities. The operation was executed with precision. Not a single member of the Kane family was discovered, yet the impact was immediate. Sugar vats were spilled, grain stores were rendered unusable, and livestock scattered into surrounding marshes. The overseers were left scrambling, unable to determine the source of their misfortune. The Kane family, meanwhile, used the incident to send coded messages across the region, encouraging other plantations to act and providing guidance for those willing to resist. This phase of coordinated resistance demonstrated a remarkable understanding of human psychology, logistics, and strategy. The Kane family had studied patterns of oversight, predictable routines, and human tendencies to exploit fear and misdirection. They anticipated reactions, created contingency plans, and executed operations with minimal risk to themselves. By the summer of 1832, they were no longer just survivors. They were strategists who had transformed the oppression they endured into a blueprint for regional liberation. The colonel, by contrast, had become a cautionary figure. His attempts to maintain order through force were futile. Security measures strained resources without preventing disruptions, and the remaining overseers grew increasingly unreliable. Fear of the Kane family's influence spread among the enslaved population, undermining traditional hierarchies and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and unrest. Ravencroft could no longer trust the very tools he had used to dominate others. Cordelia's legacy, ironically, continued to shape the rebellion. Her obsession with methodical control had inadvertently taught the Kane family the principles of observation, documentation, and manipulation, which they now applied to orchestrate resistance. Each note she had written, each diagram she had sketched became an instruction manual for survival and defiance. Her genius, once intended to enslave, had become a weapon of liberation. "The mind that sought to crush us has guided our survival," Ruth Kane reflected in a letter to a trusted ally. "Every cruelty, every plan, every flaw she recorded has been turned to our advantage. We fight not only with our hands but with knowledge she left behind." The coordinated resistance began to attract attention beyond the immediate region. Abolitionist networks in Charleston and Savannah started receiving reports of repeated disruptions, escapes and the mysterious disappearance of overseers. While local authorities attempted to dismiss these accounts, the pattern was undeniable. Letters, coded reports and eyewitness testimony indicated that something unprecedented was occurring. A network of enslaved individuals, formerly considered powerless, was actively dismantling the mechanisms of oppression with intelligence, strategy and foresight. This news reached northern abolitionist circles, which quickly recognized the significance of the Kane family's actions. The stories were disseminated through pamphlets, newspapers and speeches, inspiring other enslaved communities and free blacks to consider collective action. The southern planter elite, meanwhile, panicked. Meetings were held in secret to discuss containment strategies, but there was no coherent response. The Kane family's influence had become systemic, transcending any single plantation or individual owner. By late 1832, the cumulative effect of the Kane family's operations was undeniable. Plantation owners across multiple counties reported repeated failures, livestock lost, equipment sabotaged, crops destroyed, and overseers terrified. The once stable social order of the region was unraveling. Even the most powerful families could no longer rely on predictability, authority, or force. The myth of total control, the foundation upon which the plantation system depended, had been shattered. The Kane family had achieved what no single act of rebellion could accomplish. They had transformed oppression into opportunity, turning the knowledge, cruelty, and methodology of their oppressors against the system itself. Their actions demonstrated that resistance was not only possible under the most restrictive conditions, but could be systematically applied to dismantle even the most entrenched structures of power. "We have done more than survive," David Kane told his family one evening, standing among the trees that now marked the outer limits of their operational network. "We have taught the system its own weaknesses. Every plantation, every owner, every overseer now faces what we face. The network is growing. This is only the beginning." As 1833 approached, the Kane family's operations became even more sophisticated. They developed communication methods that avoided detection entirely, using natural signals, coded knots in ropes and patterns in laundry lines. Intelligence flowed seamlessly between plantations, enabling coordinated actions that disrupted production, security, and morale simultaneously. Their network now included dozens of plantations, each contributing intelligence, resources, and manpower. The legacy of the Ravencroft incident, the systematic cruelty, the meticulously planned resistance, the transformation of victims into strategists, was now fully realized. 7 individuals once considered property had become architects of a regional movement that undermined the foundation of the southern plantation system. And as the northern abolitionist press began to circulate reports and letters detailing these coordinated acts, the Kane family's impact extended beyond local resistance, influencing the national conversation on slavery. The events that had begun in a remote experimental building 5 years prior were now part of a growing narrative that exposed the vulnerabilities, cruelties, and eventual unsustainability of the plantation system. The story of the Kane family was no longer confined to legend. It had become history in motion, a living testament to the power of intellect, resilience, and courage under oppression. By the spring of 1833, the network that David Kane and his family had established had evolved into a sophisticated and highly coordinated operation. Their intelligence reached across counties, connecting enslaved workers with sympathetic free blacks, abolitionists, and even some marginalized whites who had quietly opposed the excesses of the plantation elite. Their actions had begun to destabilize multiple estates simultaneously, forcing plantation owners to confront the reality that resistance was no longer isolated or accidental. The Kane family, once confined to the shadows, had become the nucleus of a regional insurgent. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft, now living in near total seclusion, watched the unraveling of the Southern Plantation Order with mounting dread. He had initially believed that the death of his wife and the cover-up that followed had contained the damage, but reports of coordinated sabotage, mass escapes, and organized resistance from plantations he once thought secure reached him relentless. Each account confirmed the horrifying truth. The Kane family had not only survived but had learned from their torment, exploiting every weakness of the system he had helped enforce. "It is as if they have studied my every thought, every plan," Ravencroft muttered in the solitude of his drawing room. "Every routine, every oversight, they anticipate and exploit. It is no longer personal revenge. They are dismantling what we built." The Kane family, aware of the growing attention, began to refine their operations.
Their efforts were no longer limited to sabotage or intelligence gathering. They orchestrated interventions designed to protect and support enslaved individuals who showed potential for escape or resistance, providing hidden routes, false identities, and secure contacts in cities such as Charleston, Savannah, and even northern ports like Boston and Philadelphia. Their operation had become multi-layered, blending tactical disruption with humanitarian strategy, ensuring that those who resisted were given the tools and guidance to survive. One of the Kane family's most audacious maneuvers involved the plantation of a man named Samuel Whitaker, whose estate was considered impenetrable. Whitaker relied heavily on armed patrols, night watches, and an intricate network of informants. However, months of observation revealed a critical vulnerability. A small contingent of overseers was overburdened, and the enslaved population's knowledge of secret paths and hidden resources was extensive. Under David Kane's direction, a group infiltrated the estate over several nights. They manipulated tools and machinery to create minor accidents that appeared accidental but disrupted productivity and sowed fear among overseers. Key structures were subtly weakened to create panic during the harvest. In tandem, messages were discreetly delivered to workers, signaling that support was available and escape routes had been identified. By dawn, the plantation was in disarray. Crops were damaged, livestock had been dispersed, and panic had fractured the routine. Whitaker attempted to assert control but was met with consistent, unpredictable resistance that left him bewildered and anxious. The Kane family had struck with precision, demonstrating an understanding of both logistics and psychology that rivaled the most experienced military strategists. Every plantation has its cracks, David Kane explained to his siblings. Our task is not brute force, it is knowledge, coordination, and the patience to let the system collapse under its own assumptions of control. As the network expanded, the Southern planter elite began to realize that these disruptions were not isolated incidents. Meetings among plantation owners grew increasingly desperate. Secret councils convened to share intelligence and coordinate response. Yet every plan they devised seemed to be anticipated and countered by a system they did not fully understand. The Kane family had developed the ability to predict patterns of behavior and exploit them, turning the assumptions of the elite against. In one particularly tense meeting, representatives of the richest families of Charleston convened in a private estate to discuss a coordinated response. Colonel Ravencroft, despite his diminished status, was present, hoping to regain favor and share his insights. "We are witnessing the unthinkable," one planter whispered, his voice trembling. "This is not rebellion in the traditional sense. This is intelligence, strategy, coordination. They have turned our own system against." The discussion quickly shifted to measures of containment, armed patrols, curfews, increased surveillance, and even the construction of fortified compounds. But each measure required significant resources, and the repeated disruptions across multiple estates had drained both finances and manpower. In many ways, the Southern elite found themselves fighting a ghost, an enemy who remained unseen, yet whose influence touched every aspect of their operations. Meanwhile, the Kane family continued to develop innovations in resistance. Ruth Kane had devised a sophisticated system of coded communication using everyday objects, allowing messages to pass unnoticed among plantations. Laundry hung in specific arrangements signaled routes, safety, or warning. Bundles of firewood, arranged in patterns, conveyed information about safe houses or local threats. These seemingly innocuous signals became the lifeblood of the growing network, allowing coordination on a scale previously thought impossible for enslaved individuals. David Kane himself had begun traveling to northern cities under assumed identities, establishing direct contact with abolitionist organizations. These connections ensured that intelligence gathered in the South could be disseminated more widely, creating pressure on the federal government and increasing public awareness of the systematic oppression occurring on plantations. The Kane family's activities were no longer confined to sabotage. They were part of a broader movement that linked resistance in the South with advocacy in the North. "Knowledge is power," David explained during one clandestine meeting with abolitionists in Charleston. "If we can reveal the weaknesses of the system and provide support for those resisting, we can protect lives and challenge the very foundation of this tyranny." The response of the Southern authorities was swift, but largely ineffective. Sheriffs, local militias, and plantation enforcers attempted to track patterns of rebellion, but the Kane family's network had become adept at misdirection. False trails, staged accidents, and coded messages diverted attention away from the true sources of resistance. Plantation owners increasingly relied on fear to maintain obedience, but fear alone could not counteract a system designed with intelligence, strategy, and coordination at its core. By late 1833, the Kane family's operations had extended beyond the original region. Reports emerged of coordinated disruptions as far west as Georgia and Alabama, suggesting that enslaved individuals were using the intelligence network to undermine operations hundreds of miles away. Some reports even suggested that former members of the Kane family network had established secret schools to educate enslaved individuals, teaching literacy, arithmetic, and strategic thinking, all essential tools for effective resistance. The Southern elite began to recognize that the Kane family represented more than a tactical threat. They had become a symbol of defiance and empowerment. Stories of their coordinated operations, cunning strategy, and successful escapes spread from plantation to plantation. The mythos of the Kane family, once merely whispered, began to inspire enslaved populations across the region, undermining the psychological foundation of the plantation system itself.
Colonel Ravencroft, increasingly isolated, made desperate appeals to former allies. He proposed alliances with other planters, offered financial incentives, and even attempted to leverage legal systems to capture members of the Kane network. Yet each action was anticipated and countered. The Kane family's operations were too decentralized, too intelligent, and too mobile to be contained by conventional means. Every attempt to suppress them reinforced the perception of an invisible, omnipresent force challenging the Southern hierarchy. "We are ghosts in their minds," Ruth Kane wrote in a letter to a trusted confidant. "They see the results of our actions but cannot perceive us, and because they cannot, they make mistakes. Every mistake is an opportunity." By 1834, the Kane network had become a strategic entity of unprecedented sophistication. They had developed redundancies, contingencies, and layers of communication that allowed them to coordinate resistance, facilitate escape, and provide critical intelligence across multiple states. Their influence extended beyond individual plantations to affect entire regional economies, with repeated disruptions reducing productivity, undermining morale, and sowing uncertainty in the ranks of the elite. The Kane family had transformed the pain inflicted upon them into power. The psychological methods Cordelia had perfected, the systematic cruelty designed to break their spirits, had instead forged leaders capable of exploiting the very same principle. The knowledge they had gained under duress allowed them to operate with precision, foresight, and coordination that rivaled any contemporary military or political strategy. By 1835, the story of the Kane family was reaching a national audience. Northern newspapers published accounts, often exaggerated or anonymized, of plantations in chaos, overseers disappearing, and coordinated acts of resistance. Abolitionist groups cited these incidents to illustrate the systemic injustice of slavery, while Southern authorities struggled to suppress information without drawing further attention to their failures. The Kane family, once victims of unimaginable cruelty, had become both a practical and symbolic threat to the Southern plantation system. 7 people once considered property have proven that knowledge, courage, and strategy can dismantle what brute force could not. A Northern abolitionist wrote, "The Ravencroft incident is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of oppression." The Southern planter elite, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. New security measures were implemented, yet they only reinforced the network's influence by demonstrating the effectiveness of resistance. Reports of fires, crop destruction, and livestock losses continued, but the perpetrators remained elusive. The Kane family had shown that the system could be undermined, not through direct confrontation alone, but through intelligence, coordination, and strategy, lessons that would resonate for decades. The legacy of the Kane family's resistance extended far beyond individual plantations. They had created a model for collective action that leveraged knowledge, observation, and psychological insight. They demonstrated that even under the most restrictive conditions, oppressed individuals could organize, strategize, and achieve tangible results. The Kane family's network became a blueprint for resistance that inspired countless others, showing that the foundations of oppression were never as solid as the elite believed. Their actions had also redefined the nature of rebellion in the antebellum South. No longer confined to isolated uprisings or spontaneous acts of defiance, resistance could be deliberate, coordinated, and strategic. The Kane family had transformed suffering into education, oppression into expertise, and captivity into freedom, not only for themselves but for countless others who would follow in their footsteps. And so the Kane family had cemented their place in history. 7 individuals whose experience of unimaginable cruelty had forged a movement, challenged a system, and demonstrated that even in the darkest corners of America's past, courage, intelligence, and resilience could spark revolutionary change. By 1836, the Kane family's network had moved beyond the plantations of South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Their intelligence, coordination, and methods of resistance were no longer limited to rural operations. They began to infiltrate urban centers where enslaved and free black communities were concentrated, and where abolitionist activity was gaining momentum. Cities such as Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans became vital nodes in the growing network, allowing the Kane family to expand both the reach and the sophistication of their operation. In Charleston, Ruth Kane worked with a small cadre of trusted allies to establish safe houses and concealment strategies for escaped individuals. Utilizing knowledge gathered over years of observation, the Kane family adapted the lessons learned from plantation life to urban environments, where surveillance and informants were more pervasive. These safe houses were strategically located near ports, workshops, and sympathetic merchant establishments, enabling the rapid movement of individuals seeking freedom. "The city is a maze," Ruth wrote in one of her coded letters to David. "Every alley, every shop, every warehouse can be used as a shield or a route. We must teach them to read the city as carefully as we read the plantation." David Kane, meanwhile, began cultivating direct relationships with Northern abolitionists. Traveling under carefully constructed false identities, he visited Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, providing detailed intelligence on the vulnerabilities of Southern plantations, the methods used by overseers, and the networks already in place to resist them. These connections not only offered protection for escaped individuals but also amplified the psychological impact of the Kane family's operation. Reports and letters published in Northern newspapers began to cite the Kane family as evidence of organized, intelligent resistance that could not be contained by force alone. One of the most significant urban operations involved the covert rescue of a group of enslaved workers from a shipping warehouse in Savannah. The Kane network had learned that the group was scheduled to be transported to a distant plantation under heavily armed supervision. Using coded signals from laundry lines, prearranged signals at docks, and misdirection of guards, the Kane family orchestrated a nighttime intervention that freed the individuals without alerting authority. The operation required precise timing, coordinated effort across multiple neighborhoods, and a deep understanding of both human behavior and the physical environment. This rescue operation marked a turning point. It demonstrated that the Kane network could extend beyond rural plantations and still maintain its high level of efficiency and secrecy. For the elite in the South, the implication was terrifying. Their control extended only as far as their ignorance allowed, and the Kane family's reach was rapidly growing. "We are no longer confined by geography," David Kane noted in a meeting with Al. "Knowledge, timing, and coordination are our greatest weapons. We must exploit every opportunity to expand our influence." As the Kane network grew, so did its methods of communication. Ruth Kane developed a more sophisticated system of coded letters, hidden compartments in furniture, and signals embedded in everyday items. Abolitionist allies in the North were trained to recognize these codes, which allowed for the secure transfer of intelligence and resources. David Kane also introduced a system of messengers, carefully chosen for their reliability and discretion, who could move between rural plantations and urban centers with minimal risk of detection. The Kane family's efforts began to influence broader patterns of resistance across the South. Reports from multiple states indicated that coordinated acts of defiance, sabotage, and escape were increasingly occurring simultaneously. Crops were destroyed, overseers disappeared, and plantations previously considered secure were suddenly vulnerable. These actions created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among the planter elite, who were increasingly unable to predict or control the behavior of those they enslaved. Colonel Ravencroft, now completely marginalized and living under constant scrutiny from former allies, watched helplessly as the Kane family's influence expanded. Despite attempts to regain his social standing through financial bribes and political maneuvering, he could not reverse the damage. The network's ability to anticipate his moves, combined with the support they received from abolitionist contacts in the North, rendered his influence null. His personal fear, once driven by shame and humiliation, became compounded by the realization that his actions had unintentionally contributed to the creation of an organized system capable of undermining slavery itself. By 1837, the Kane family had become a central intelligence hub for resistance throughout the South. Their operations were no longer ad hoc. They had evolved into a disciplined, coordinated effort with clearly defined objectives, contingency plans, and strategic foresight. Enslaved individuals and free blacks who sought guidance or assistance were connected to the network, taught how to navigate dangers, and provided with the resources necessary to escape or resist. The psychological dimension of the Kane family's work was as critical as its operational one.
David Kane insisted that every freed individual should understand not only how to escape, but also how to maintain their autonomy and dignity once free. The Kane family emphasized education, literacy, and self-determination, ensuring that those they helped could continue the work of resistance and contribute to a growing culture of defiance. Freedom is more than absence of chains, David explained. It is the ability to think, act, and plan for oneself. Every person we aid is a node in a larger network of liberation. The Southern elite attempted increasingly severe measures to suppress this rising tide of resistance. Laws were tightened, patrols increased, and brutal punishments were meted out to those caught attempting to escape. Yet each escalation by the authorities served only to demonstrate the limitations of their power. The Kane network remained agile, decentralized, and highly adaptive, constantly evolving in response to new threats and challenges. In some cases, these efforts included misdirection and deception at unprecedented levels. The Kane family orchestrated scenarios in which plantation owners were made to believe they had captured rebels or thwarted operations, only to discover later that the real resistance had already moved elsewhere. These tactics further destabilized the South's confidence in its own enforcement mechanisms, proving that intelligence and strategy could outmatch force and fear. By 1838, the influence of the Kane network was being felt in unexpected ways. Financial records indicated that plantations across the South were experiencing systemic losses due to sabotage, decreased productivity, and coordinated disruption of supply lines. Abolitionist publications began to cite these events as evidence of widespread unrest and as proof of the inherent instability of the slave system. The Kane family's work had begun to create ripples that extended far beyond the plantations directly involved. David Kane's urban operations, combined with the continuing influence of his siblings in rural areas, had created an interlinked system that functioned almost like a clandestine government of resistance. The network provided intelligence, logistics, education, and strategic direction to a growing number of enslaved and free black individuals. In essence, the Kane family had transformed their personal tragedy into a sophisticated operation, capable of challenging the very foundation of Southern society. "We must be both seen and unseen," David instructed his team during a clandestine meeting in Charleston. "Every act of resistance is a lesson, every intervention a demonstration of possibility. We are not just freeing individuals, we are undermining an entire system built on cruelty and fear." Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Kane family's success was their ability to maintain secrecy, despite the scale of their operations. While the South's authorities remained aware that resistance was occurring, they were unable to pinpoint its leadership or method of coordination. Plantation owners, increasingly desperate, relied on fear, rumors, and punitive measures, which only strengthened the Kane family's influence. The network's adaptability ensured that it could respond to challenges, absorb disruptions, and continue operating with remarkable efficiency. The broader implications of the Kane family's actions were profound. Their network demonstrated that enslaved and oppressed individuals could organize, plan, and execute complex operations, directly challenging the prevailing assumptions of Southern plant. Resistance was no longer spontaneous. It could be strategic, deliberate, and highly effective. This realization fundamentally altered the psychological and operational landscape of slavery in the South, forcing authorities to confront the possibility that the system itself was inherently vulnerable. By 1840, the Kane family's influence had begun to shape the strategies of abolitionist movements in the North. Reports, letters, and intelligence from the South provided concrete evidence of systemic oppression and the potential for organized resistance. Abolitionists began incorporating these accounts into speeches, publications, and campaigns, using the Kane family's story as both inspiration and proof that enslaved individuals were capable of strategic thought, leadership, and self-liberation. In the South, the ripple effects continued to destabilize plantations. Coordinated acts of defiance, ranging from crop sabotage to the disappearance of overseers, spread uncertainty and fear among the elite. The Kane family's model inspired other networks, further amplifying the impact. By demonstrating that systematic cruelty could forge leadership rather than submission, the Kane family had rewritten the rules of resistance and redefined the possibilities of freedom in the antebellum South. The legacy of the Kane family's operations extended far beyond their immediate victories. Their efforts revealed the vulnerabilities of a system that relied on dehumanization, fear, and isolation. By connecting enslaved and free black individuals across vast distances, providing education and resources, and coordinating complex acts of resistance, The Kane family became the architects of a movement that challenged both the morality and the viability of slavery itself. In essence, the Kane family transformed their suffering into a blueprint for liberation, proving that intelligence, strategy, and courage could overturn even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Their story became a symbol of hope, resistance, and the enduring power of human ingenuity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. By the early 1840s, the Kane family's influence had expanded far beyond the plantations where their resistance had first taken root. The network they had meticulously constructed now stretched across the southern states and into northern urban centers, linking enslaved and free black communities, abolitionists, sympathetic merchants, and former allies of the Kane family. What had begun as a personal struggle for survival and justice had evolved into a sophisticated, coordinated operation capable of shaping the social, political, and economic landscape of the antebellum South. Northern abolitionists had begun to recognize the extraordinary value of the intelligence provided by the Kane family. Detailed accounts of plantation operations, overseer behavior, and patterns of resistance allowed reformers to craft narratives that exposed the systemic cruelty of slavery. David Kane and his siblings were careful to provide actionable intelligence while safeguarding the identities of those still enslaved. Their contributions were integrated into publications, speeches, and campaigns, giving Northern reformers the hard evidence they needed to argue convincingly against the institution of slavery. These reports are not mere anecdotes, one abolitionist editor noted. They provide irrefutable documentation that enslaved individuals are not passive, but capable of organized thought, leadership, and resistance on a scale that challenges the very foundation of Southern power. The Kane family's urban operations in northern cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were particularly influential. Using carefully constructed aliases and networks of safe houses, they facilitated escapes, relayed intelligence about Southern plantations, and helped establish lines of communication between formerly enslaved individuals and sympathetic Northern citizens. The family's methods were deceptively simple yet highly effective. Coded letters, disguised signals, and trusted intermediaries ensured the secure transfer of information while minimizing the risk of exposure.
David Kane himself took a leading role in these northern operations. He traveled extensively under assumed identities, meeting with abolitionist leaders and providing detailed instructions for helping escaped individuals. He also worked to cultivate financial and logistical support for the network, connecting wealthy northern sympathizers with critical resources such as food, clothing, transport, and temporary lodging. Each of these connections strengthened the overall resistance effort, creating a web of interdependent support that was difficult for Southern authorities to penetrate. Ruth Kane, meanwhile, continued to manage the southern arm of the network. She oversaw intelligence gathering from rural plantations, coordinated safe passages, and maintained lines of communication with allies in urban centers. Her meticulous planning and deep understanding of plantation systems allowed the network to anticipate potential threats and adapt in real time. The Kane family had essentially created a dual operating system, one focused on liberation intelligence in the South, the other on protection, advocacy, and support in the North. The network's effectiveness became increasingly evident in 1843, when a coordinated series of escapes across multiple Southern states demonstrated the sophistication and reach of the Kane family's operation. Small groups of enslaved individuals disappeared simultaneously from plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, moving along prearranged routes that had been meticulously planned to avoid detection. The efficiency and timing of these operations astonished both Northern allies and Southern authorities. "We are witnessing a revolution that is invisible," wrote one Northern abolitionist. "It is not a violent rebellion in the streets, but a methodical dismantling of slavery from within, led by those who have suffered its cruelties most directly." The Kane family's operations were not limited to facilitating escape. They also engaged in strategic acts of economic disruption, carefully targeting crops, tools, and infrastructure in ways that created maximum pressure on plantation owners while minimizing harm to enslaved individuals. In many cases, these acts were carried out with remarkable precision, demonstrating a deep understanding of both agriculture and plantation logistics. The psychological impact of these disruptions was profound. Planters became increasingly paranoid, spending vast sums on security measures that failed to prevent losses or insulate them from the growing climate of defiance. David Kane's leadership emphasized both strategy and ethics. While the family engaged in sabotage to weaken the system of slavery, they took great care to ensure that their actions did not endanger lives unnecessarily. Their philosophy was clear: dismantle the machinery of oppression while empowering the individuals themselves to claim freedom and autonomy. This dual approach, combining direct action with education, strategic planning, and moral clarity, distinguished the Kane family from other resistance efforts and contributed to their remarkable effectiveness. The 1840s also saw an expansion of the Kane family's influence into political sphere. Abolitionist politicians in the North used intelligence provided by the Kane network to advocate for anti-slavery legislation and to build coalitions capable of challenging the institution at a systemic level. While the family itself remained hidden, their work had tangible effects on policy and public opinion. Newspapers reported growing unrest among enslaved populations in the South, and the Kane family's intelligence allowed Northern reformers to provide both moral and practical support to those seeking freedom. In the South, the impact of the Kane family's operations reached deep into the psyche of the planter elite. Families that had once relied on fear, intimidation, and violence to maintain control now faced uncertainty at every turn. Overseers disappeared, crops failed, tools and equipment were sabotaged, and the remaining enslaved population became increasingly emboldened. Each success of the Kane network reinforced the perception that slavery was inherently unstable, and that even the most carefully maintained plantations could be undermined by intelligence, planning, and strategic resistance. "They are ghosts in our own homes," one South Carolina planter wrote in a private journal in 18. "They move unseen, strike with precision, and vanish before we can respond. No amount of fear or punishment can touch them." The Kane family's network was further strengthened by the moral authority derived from their own history of survival and resistance. Their story, from the original torture and imprisonment on the Ravencroft plantation to their meticulous escape and establishment of an intelligence network, provided a powerful narrative of resilience, ingenuity, and justice. This history not only inspired those who were directly aided by the Kane network, but also served as a model for broader resistance movements. By the mid-1840s, the Kane family's operations were beginning to influence the broader trajectory of the antebellum South. Plantation owners who had once considered themselves invulnerable now recognized that enslaved and formerly enslaved individuals could organize, plan, and execute coordinated actions with devastating effect. The fear generated by these operations contributed to an increasingly unstable social environment, forcing the South's elite to devote resources and attention to security rather than production. Economic records from the period indicate that multiple plantations suffered substantial losses due to the combination of escapes, sabotage, and worker resistance, all coordinated or inspired by the Kane family network. One particularly daring operation involved the liberation of an enslaved artisan group from New Orleans in 18. The artisans were scheduled to be transported for labor on a large-scale construction project, which would have permanently separated families and disrupted community network. Using intelligence gathered from Northern allies as well as local informants, the Kane family coordinated a rescue that involved diversions, safe passage through urban waterways, and temporary concealment in sympathetic households. Every participant in the operation acted with precision, minimizing risk to both the artisans and the operatives themselves. The success of this mission further cemented the Kane family's reputation for strategic brilliance and moral clarity. "Every operation teaches a lesson," David Kane wrote in his journal, "not merely in tactics, but in courage, solidarity, and the power of knowledge. Each successful rescue undermines not just a plantation but the very idea that oppression is insurmountable." The psychological impact of such operations extended beyond immediate participants. Enslaved individuals throughout the South began to recognize that resistance was both possible and effective. They learned to communicate in subtle ways, share information, and prepare for opportunities to escape or disrupt operation. Even in regions where surveillance was intense, the principles established by the Kane family enabled a culture of calculated defiance that challenged assumptions about submission and obedience. The Kane family's work in the 1840s illustrates a key principle: oppression can generate not only suffering, but also ingenuity, intelligence, and resilience. Their network demonstrated that systematic cruelty could inadvertently create leaders, strategists, and planners capable of outmaneuvering oppressors. Every act of resistance, every escape, and every disruption was both a tactical success and a moral statement. The human spirit cannot be broken entirely, even under the most extreme conditions. By the end of the decade, the Kane network had established itself as a formidable force. Enslaved and free black communities alike recognized its influence. Northern abolitionists relied on its intelligence, and Southern authorities lived in a state of growing uncertainty. The Kane family's ability to combine strategic planning, ethical guidance, intelligence gathering, and operational execution allowed them to shape events in ways that few contemporaries could have imagined. Their story, rooted in tragedy and personal suffering, had transformed into a blueprint for liberation, resilience, and organized resistance. The Ravencroft plantation, where the Kane family had first endured systematic cruelty, became the origin point of a movement that fundamentally challenged the assumptions and structures of the antebellum South. Their operations in the 1840s demonstrate how intelligence, coordination, and moral clarity can transform the powerless into architects of their own destiny, and in doing so shake the foundations of even the most entrenched systems of oppression.